Does that seem to be working in back? Thank you. So nice to be with you, friends. Feeling grateful for the privilege of working at the Maxwell Institute and for Spencer Fluman's brainchild here in this series, and to Jenny and all of her work that we've had a brief taste of. My contribution to this series of the Doctrine and Covenants had to do with time, and so my volume, myself, are naturally the recipients of my name is had for good and ill in a very small block, but it sponsors curiosity, why time and the Doctrine and Covenants. So I'll just comment for a moment about that and suggest an implication or two of the effort. In what we know as section 117 of the Doctrine and Covenants, the Lord has, or Joseph has the Lord saying, "Let my servant Newell K. Whitney be ashamed of all his littleness of soul before me." That is my new favorite sin to be aware of, to be wary of. Littleness of soul. Liking it unto myself, ever since focusing on that verse, I've sort of meditated. Let Philip L. Barlow be ashamed of his littleness of soul before me. Just about a decade earlier, in what we know as section 19, the Lord to Martin Harris, "And again I command thee that thou shalt not covet thine own property." Did you know that we had sins like don't have littleness of soul and don't covet your own property? This gospel of ours is not boring. It is as wide and as deep as all outdoors, but sometimes we make the gospel too small. Sometimes, as the Doctrine and Covenants also forbids us, our imaginations fail us. The gospel that Joseph brought into the world, the gospel that Joseph was midwife to in the restoration, is not just a test. It is not, as Carol and I were talking before the meeting, a Augustinian penal colony. It's not just an omelet of commandments and covenants and who's got the right authority and attending church meetings. Instead, all these are in service to God's purpose behind creation, to lift the intelligences around him in the universe to a higher capacity, a godly capacity and joy and fullness. That means that, like life, the gospel is about living itself. It's not just a moral test, it's also a school for becoming what the Lord invites us to become. And it requires, this enterprise, more than just striving to be good and to obey commandments. To be godly entails mastering skills and acquiring wisdom and exercising imagination and not being commanded in all things. And it requires discipline, which, as you sense, shares a root with the concept of disciple. Meaning, echoing Terrell a little bit and coming at it from a little different angle, meaning comes to existence in our world through relationships. And I consider 5 of them most primal: our relationship with God, our relationship with one another, our relationship with our complicated and errant selves, our relationship with the outside world as far as we can make it out, and our relationship with time. If our relationship with time is messed up, our relationship with ourselves and one another and God and often the outside world will be messed up. If our relationship with ourself is messed up, our relationship with one another and God will be messed up. Time, then, is what I decided to focus on, because we do talk a bit about our relationship with deity in the church, and we do talk about our relationship with one another and sometimes with ourselves, but we haven't made much headway in isolating time as a concept that is relevant to the gospel in this profound way. Time, however, is an invisible principle. We all talk about time in the ordinary course of things, like I'm late, or I'm early, or I don't have enough of it, or I'm miserable because she broke my heart and time is going ever so slowly. We know that it's elastic in some sense, but I mean time with a capital T, time as such, whose characteristics we can think about if we name it and stop and ponder about it and begin to recognize that time is in intimate relationship with faith and with repentance and with the new birth of baptism and with the always be with us Spirit thing, reason that we take the sacrament, etc. So important is time, and so essential is it for, in relationship, bringing the other principles into something we might call alive, true, and living. So important is this that I've taken, and I do so in the book, I've taken to calling time the zeroth principle of the gospel. Zeroth because it's unofficial, and I have no standing among you to make official principles, and zeroth because all the others hinge on them for their existence and their vitality in some respects. So my volume's about time, and my suggestion is that we would be better at making the gospel true and living if we became time literate. If we recognize time as a discrete notion worthy of study, worthy of prayer, worthy of practice, it might spare us some difficulties. It could open space for our understanding of other principles to expand and blossom. For we are all afflicted with time wounds, elementally at every point. I learned this back where I used to teach at a little private college, Hanover College in Indiana, and I taught a course on religion, evil, and human suffering, and I came to recognize how often the suffering leads to time concerns and inflicts time wounds. And on the other hand, a time literacy and a time awareness and a disciplined practice with time, a more heightened awareness and consciousness and interaction with time can bring something of the joy and fullness promised elsewhere by the Lord in association with our gospel principles. It would change us if we became time literate. It would change our view of the world. It would change our view of ourselves and how we are situated in the universe. And it would change our relationship to divinity, or of how to go about a day. Since it is time to close, I'll just gesture towards not explaining all those assertions, but I will make a few more just to suggest what are the outcomes of this sort of meditation. One example is that you can change the past. I call that a primal superpower, but think about faith in relation to it for a moment, or read about it if you're in the mode to later. Or think about it in relation to reconciling the past and the present in the act of repentance. You can change the past, and as a matter of fact, we all do change the past in the course of walking backwards into the future, as some poet once put it. Another example is that Terrell's agency in the thought of a great many people he's partly arguing against, but in among the Augustinians and the Calvinists of the world, but also these days among biologists and psychologists and philosophers and many others, argue that our agency is largely a mirage. One way you can glimpse what they're getting at is if you think of your beloved ones who are beset with dementia and their short-term memory is gone, and they will keep saying the same thing and doing the same behavior as though they're pre-programmed for it. And there's something to it, as Terrell acknowledges. Our agency isn't what we imagine it to be. I can do anything I want, but rather I can choose in a given moment among live options to me. But for those live options to be very real, to be very substantial, is involved with time between any stimulus and our response to it. We have the capacity to pause, to expand and enter in and become responsive and responsible rather than reactive creatures. We have problematic ways of imagining the second coming of the Lord and the millennium that we could imagine as a glorious event, but some of the ways we think about this kind of time get us or others in trouble. Ways we think about it, and as the wrong reading of the Doctrine and Covenants suggests, can foster an image of a vengeful, implacable God, can undermine faith. That is, the second coming has been coming any minute now for 200 years. No, for 2,000 years. What do we do with that? It might help us to be alert to different kinds of time, different classes of time that can be probed. We can, by an errant thinking about the millennium, help prove Karl Marx almost right. That is, we can spend our time sucking our thumbs or looking into the future rather than caring for the earth, or in some radical cases, rather than sending our children to school. That's a lot of expense to go to college, a lot of sweat when Jesus is going to come in 3 years or 13 years. Some Latter-day Saints have gone on record as saying. And finally, and fourth, we can create a state of current urgency and a neurotic, anxious people in a generation of anxiety like ours in the secular world. By wrong thinking, we can actually add to neurotic anxiety in an unhelpful way. But there are many more positive things that we can do with our time. I call the first chapter in the book Radical Sabbath Acoustics, a reimagined Sabbath, or a Sabbath reimagined from our modern day practices and hearkening back to its roots, has the capacity to answer President Nelson's inquiry of us. How do you hear him? The brilliant writer, Rabbi Abraham Heschel, ends his little book on the Sabbath with this sentence, speaking of the Sabbath: eternity utters a day. The Sabbath is a day on the calendar, but cannot be reduced to a day on the calendar. A Sabbath is a philosophy in the guise of time. And before ancient Israel had a temple in space, it had a temple in time, and worked hard and got off track sometimes, but not always. We can misapply and over-apply Jesus's conflict with the Pharisees and misunderstand Christ as finding the Sabbath dispensable, and that would be an error. So time affects gospel principles that are obvious to us by their names, like Sabbath or like millennium or like preexistence. But I suggest that, as with agency and many other principles, time affects it all. It would be good if we surrendered our time illiteracy so that we might mend our time wounds. So, thank you.